Hi everyone, welcome to this video where we will be looking at the AWS Cloud Control Provider. Before we look into the provider specifications, I want to highlight the need. Why do we need this provider? Why this Cloud Control Provider giving you on top of the standard AWS provider, and how it works and how we can create resources and some examples of resources that we can create. Now, let me take an example of an S3 bucket. I'm taking the AWS CLI commands, but this should, map to the AWS or the Bodo 3 or SDK, Go SDK that Terraform AWS provider is based on. If you see for an S3 bucket, I have different options like make bucket, list bucket, copy something from it, or remove bucket and things like that. For a Lambda function, it's create function, delete function, get function. So many options that are specific to the service. So these are service specific names and service specific nouns. So if I go to EC2, it looks something like run instance, um, like create IPAM pool or delete instance. So many things are specific to that service. So as someone is working with these resources, creating some sort of a mechanism to, let's say, provision these resources, they need to be aware of those service specific nouns, so service specific verbs. And that's where Cloud Control API comes into picture. So the intention of this Cloud Control API is to give you that standardized layer over resource creation or resource lifecycle. If you think about it, when you work with any service or resource, you have few operations in mind. You want to create the resource, you may want to read the resource, you want to read an existing resource, you want to update a resource, you want to delete the resource uh, once the usage is done. Maybe list the types of resources that you want to look at from your AWS account. Now that's exactly what this Cloud Control API gives, in addition to some resource request, some background APIs that it has. Now if you look at the create resource operation, it takes in a type name and a desired state at a bare minimum. Type name is the name of the resource. From a CloudFormation standpoint, let's say I believe it gives you an example in here for Kinesis. So yeah, it is saying, hey, create a resource called Kinesis stream with the desired state. As in, a desired state is what you want that resource to be in the AWS side. So if I'm creating an AWS S3 bucket, I could look at it as AWS Cloud Control, create resource, type name is AWS S3 bucket with the desired state of bucket name. Similarly, for function, it'll look like AWS Cloud Control, create function, type name, AWS Lambda hyphen function or colon function. Now that standardizes the API or standardizes the structure on how you interact with an AWS service. The AWS Cloud Control Provider is based on that, which means once the initial handler code is written or the initial structure is created to interface with the Cloud Control API, as there do not need to be any additional changes from the Cloud Control handler, from the Cloud Control Provider handler standpoint, because they all should follow the same structure and the schema which is adhering to the Cloud Control API. All you need is the schema definition and the type name which matches your CloudFormation resource structure. So that is what your that is what your Cloud Control API is going to use. Let's take a look at an example of S3 bucket. I did mistype it, but it still pulled it up. Okay, the AWS S3 bucket in this case, if you're familiar with an AWS resource from a resource block from a Terraform AWS provider, it should look very similar, except for this prefix of AWSCC. So let me copy this over into my VS Code and see how it behaves. Copy this over. Now if I see this, I'm going to remove this tags for the time being. All I need is the bare minimum reference. I'm going to add it as, let's say, Manu 2024 YouTube July. And to give you an idea that I do not have this resource already. So run an AWS S3 LS, I don't have that resource or S3 bucket defined already. Now this is an AWS CC resource, which means I need to have the AWS CC provider configured. Similar to the AWS provider, you can pull this up from the provider configuration. In this case, let's say use provider, I can pull this up from this provider configuration. I'm not going to specify the version, but again, as you work with any new version, you'll have that same you have the same ability to provide or pin your version with respect to the resource that you're working with, or the provider that you're working with. So all you need to provide is similar to any other platform, any other provider that you're working with. It's in this case AWSCC, the source is here, and the provider configuration. I already have the region and AWS credentials specified, so I don't have to provide those. Otherwise, you can provide those, for example, the region and let's say the access key specifications or role ARN or anything of that nature. I'm not going to provide it because it's already configured in my terminal. Going back to the main.tf, let's take a look at these steps. This should look similar to anyone who has used Terraform. You're going to initialize the provider and the backend and any modules that you're using. In this case, it pulled down the latest version of AWSCC provider. If you're on a Terraform plan, it should look at the current state of infrastructure in my AWS account, see if that resource exists. Otherwise, create a plan to provision that resource for me. So now, as it does it, this will look similar to how any Terraform plan should, because it still is based on the same Terraform plugin framework or provider framework. So it's letting me know that it's going to create a resource with a name called Manu 2024 YT June. Now I'm going to do this apply. I'm going to auto approve it so that I don't have to type in yes again. Well, let's see how it gets created. Now again, it is going to show you the plan again as with any Terraform apply, and give it a couple of seconds that this resource should be created, and I can check. So that resource is created, and if you go to AWS S3LS, you have the resource out there that I created. Sorry, the resource that I have out there that I created right now. Now, if you go to the Terraform state, it should still behave the same as you'd expect. It has those specifications of what you'd expect from some of the configurations, some of the resource structure that you have. The state should actually pull down the resource for you. So that just created the resource. Let me see if I can delete the resource to complete this life cycle. I did not provide the auto approve just to showcase that it is still following the same Terraform structure because it's still an additional provider that you're working with. Now, as it destroys it, let me pull up why or where you might use this provider. Let me take an example of a resource like Business. Let me pull up the AWS standard provider in that case. Let me change this to the AWS provider. And if I go to the documentation and look for, it's a Business as a resource. Currently, Amazon Business is not a supported resource with an AWS provider, though the support is being added by the community and by AWS and HashiCorp. So for the time being, standard provider doesn't support Business. So what if you want to deploy a workload or create a Business application or create an index or data source to provide or run your chatbot or your workload in that case? AWSCC supports it. So in this case, let me copy this structure over while it deploys that I can talk you through. So what you're looking for is resources that are currently supported in the CloudFormation registry. The moment it's added, the schema is added to the CloudFormation registry, due to the single interface, the consistent interface that Cloud Control provides, the handler that is written for those create, read, delete, update, and list resource definitions or API is able to pull the schema and work with any new resources or features that are added. Yes, there are some nuances around it where the provisioning type has to be fully mutable, but we'll get into those details in another video where we talk about what sort of resources or what sort of things they need to look out for when you look for Cloud Control API support. In this case, all I'm doing is I'm using the standard provider, in this case, the SSO admin instance, to pull down some resource references. And I'm calling the AWSCC business application with a description and display at a bare minimum reference, saying, hey, I'm adding a tag and some attachment configuration. Now, I remember I have not provided the AWS provider configuration, but I'm using an AWS provider data source. So let me update this. And since I'm pulling in an additional provider, let me do a Terraform minute. It is using the cached AWSCC provider, but pulling in the AWS provider as you'd expect the standard provider. Now I'm using the data source to look up the existing identity center instance that I have in my AWS account. So it's going to use that reference while I associate the identity center that is required for the Kubernetes application. Let me do a Terraform apply. Now what it should do is it should look at the resource structure that I have, and it says it's going to create the Kubernetes application for me. There are a few things it generates or creates on the basis of the input that I provided. And to show you that I do not have any resources at this point, if I look at my Kubernetes application, it doesn't have one. It is getting created right now, and it got created successfully, in fact. It just got created. I believe the CLI is, yeah, it is done. So if you look at the ID that I have in here, if I look at the example Kubernetes application, and that application ID should be the same, which is 7E, starting with 7E and ending at BB1. Okay, so that showcases an example of a use case or a case where you can deploy a resource which is not readily available in the standard provider, but you can use Kubernetes application or the AWSCC provider once it's available in the CloudFormation registry. Now we'll get into some more details around how that CloudFormation registry can be looked up, or Cloud Control Provider API can be looked up to see if the resource is supported. But at this point, I'm going to stop this video, and hope you found this video useful. If you have any, if you have any questions, if you have any comments specific to this, please let me know. There is an AWS blog out there which talks about it. I'll link it in the description, so you can take a look at it and see how you can use this provider.